A good Erev Shabbos, Chag Sameach. While we are reading the parsha of Kedoshim Tihiyu, you should be holy because I am holy, says God, we're also celebrating the amazing and world-changing event of the establishment of the State of Israel on the 5th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, 5708, 1948, corresponding to 74 years ago this Friday. The establishment of the state was declared by David Ben-Gurion on May 14th of that year, the 5th of Iyar, which, like this year, is a Friday, Erev Shabbos. At a certain point in its history, Israel decided to move celebrations of Independence Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut, back one day or even 2 days if Hey Iyar occurred on Friday or Shabbos, so that celebrations would not run the risk of accidentally involving any violation of Shabbat. Also, at a certain point, Israel established Yom HaZikaron, a day of remembrance for its fallen fighters on the eve of Independence Day. Toronto commemorates both with a Tekes Ma'avar, a transition ceremony from mourning the fallen soldiers, transitioning right into celebrating the gift of an independent state that took place on Wednesday night at the JCC, thanks to Mizrahi Canada. We always look for connections between what we see in the world around us and the timeless lessons and wisdom from our Torah readings of the week. So it's most appropriate to ask this week in particular, what is the connection of Kedoshim, of being a holy people, to the land of Israel, which we refer to as Artseinu HaKadosha, our holy land? What does that mean exactly, and how much of our holiness is bound up with living in the land of Israel? Can we really have a complete Jewish life without living in the land of Israel? That's a question most of us have probably asked ourselves at one time or another. Some have put the question on hold. Some of us have found an answer in striving to make holy whatever ground we happen to be walking on. Still others have chosen to make Israel their permanent home. And for some, it's a combination of all the above. A microcosm of the connection of this land to this people through this Torah is our Parsha, Kedoshim, this week. God offers us the chance to be a holy people, to express that holiness, that specialness, that sense of being dedicated to a higher calling through our everyday actions, not just one special day a week, not just when we're at prayer, but through our most workaday of actions. Some 8% of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah are spelled out in this week's Torah reading. Among those 51 mitzvahs are the mitzvah to leave the corners of your field for the poor, called Peah. Also to leave the ends of your vineyard for the poor to gather grapes, if you happen to be a vintner. Also, it's a separate mitzvah to leave the fallen grapes behind when you gather, so the needy can take them and enjoy them. So the question is raised about all these mitzvahs and ones similar to them. In other words, agricultural laws. Once, to our sorrow, so many Jews are not living in Israel, but rather living in Babylon, eventually North Africa, Italy, and eventually so many other places around the globe. Do these laws have to do with the Jew himself or herself, meaning whatever we farm, wherever we farm, we keep these mitzvahs, or do they have to do specifically with the land of Israel? Meaning, just when we're in Israel, our holy land, that's when we take tithes, that's when we consider the first fruits of the harvest to be sanctified, and so on. And those ones we mentioned in this week's portion, leaving some of our crop, some of our harvest behind, so that others can share in the bounty. Are these mitzvot dependent on the land? Teluyot ba'aretz is the phrase that's used, or are they universal? Let's be clear, other mitzvahs in this same parsha are applicable without question in every time, in every geographic locale. Parshas Kedoshim elaborates a mitzvah not to hate another Jew in our hearts. Lo sisna es achicha bilvavecha. The next verse continues with a separate mitzvah, to love a fellow Jew. V'ahavta l'reacha kamoicha. Ani Hashem. Love a fellow Jew, because God is God. We are never to turn astray to idol worship, never to swear falsely, nor to commit robbery, nor delay paying our hired workers on time. We're forbidden to pervert justice in civil court cases. Some say that the most essential human relations mitzvah of all is written here. Lo sa'amod al dam re'acha. Do not stand idly by while another's blood is being shed. How true that is when people are being killed mercilessly. And we remember another verse in Parshas Re'eh that teaches us, Adam hu hanefesh, the blood is the soul. So when another person's soul is being destroyed, maybe their body remains intact, but when their soul is being destroyed, we're also forbidden from remaining a passive bystander. These mitzvahs are most definitely not dependent on our presence in the land of Israel in any way. Wherever on earth we find ourselves, in whatever situation, these mitzvahs are fully incumbent upon us. They are our life and the length of our days. Indeed, that's how we remain alive. So back to our question. It's worthwhile to ask, what exactly is the centrality of the land to Jewish life, Jewish law, halacha, and the idea of Kedusha, of holiness, when we're specifically called upon this week to be Kedoshim, to be holy people. Rabbi Michal Rosenzweig, Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, takes up this question in an essay in the Koren Yom Ha'atzmaut Machzer, which is a very nice sefer you might enjoy having in your library. Building on the legacy of the patriarchs, he writes, Abraham, who was called upon to leave the security and comfort of his birthplace to begin a new life in Israel. Isaac, who was born there and never set foot outside Israel. And Jacob, who sojourned in different places at different times for different reasons, and yet carries the very name Yisrael. Rav Rosenzweig weighs the contributions of the diaspora communities over time, including our own, as well as the Babylonian community that produced the Talmud, Spanish Jewry, in which its golden age produced Rambam, Ramban, so many other great commentators, European Jewries, codifiers of law, and so on. So many great leaders, thinkers, and writers, teachers of our people, in addition to the majority of us throughout most of the last 2,000 years, have lived outside of Israel. There's no minimizing the value and sanctity of Jewish life outside of Israel. And yet, he quotes the Mishnah in Kedoshim that argues that all the halachos of the land are specifically and exclusively applicable only in Israel, as we've mentioned. Furthermore, the governance of the Jewish calendar, setting time and deciding when the new month occurs so that we know when to celebrate the holidays, as well as fixing the leap years of the Jewish calendar, should be done from our central location in Jerusalem, says the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin. That same Gemara mentions the chain of religious leadership, semicha, rabbinic ordination, should only be conferred in the land of Israel. Semicha, in the classical sense, is the chain of tradition that proceeds from Moshe and Joshua, Moshe and Yeshua, and enables judges to decide capital crimes, civil disputes, and other legal decisions. Rav Rosenzweig explores the various arguments that have been recorded limiting rabbinic ordination just to Israel. Obviously, we've made some accommodation over the centuries, but the questions still stand. Bear in mind that in this view of the Jewish world, decisions made by a Sanhedrin, a Jewish Supreme Court of sorts, has jurisdiction over diaspora communities all around the world, even though its judges only receive ordination in Israel. A complementary aspect of this conceptualization of Israeli Jewry vis-a-vis diaspora is technical, but very interesting as well. Tractate Horayos in the Talmud deals with the consequences of the whole or the majority of people having committed a sin unintentionally because they followed an erroneous ruling of the great Sanhedrin. If anyone tries to tell you that we think rabbis, even great judges of the generation, are infallible, you can point them to this Gemara. The Sanhedrin in this case issues a judgment which is mistaken, and the people follow it, which is the right thing to do, but it turns out objectively to have been the wrong thing. The kapara for this, the atonement, is one single offering called the Par Helem Davar Shel Tzibur, which is a communal offering for a matter which is concealed from view, we can call it. Rav Rosenzweig points out that the calculation of a majority here takes into account only Jews living in Israel. This halacha can ultimately affect all of world Jewry wherever they live, but it could be that this one single offering affects atonement for the entire nation. It seems to underscore quite powerfully the centrality of Israel to global Jewish identity, in the rabbinic mind at least. Maybe the most immediately pressing question of Israel's centrality in our lives is the dispute as to whether it is a mitzvah or not to settle in and to live in the land of Israel. Of course, if you live in the land of Israel, there are more opportunities to fulfill more mitzvot in day-to-day life. However, if we accept the notion that living in Israel is itself a mitzvah, that might obligate us to do so, even to the point of spending up to 1/5 of our assets, if that would enable us to fulfill a positive commandment, according to Ramah, Shulchan Aruch. Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman, who lived in Spain in the 1200s, lists settling in the land of Israel among his list of the 613 commandments. Rambam, Moshe ben Maimon famously, does not. He lived about a generation before. Ramban, the former one we're discussing, notes several mitzvahs that he feels Rambam, the latter, omitted from his list. He writes, and I'm quoting, "We have been commanded to take possession of the land and dwell in it. If so, it is a positive precept for all generations and binding upon every individual, even during the period of exile, as is clear from many places in the Talmud." End of quote. Rambam himself writes in his introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot that he did not include in the list such general commandments as "you shall keep my statutes." That's a statement of the Torah, clearly a mitzvah, but it encompasses so many others that it can't logically be listed as a discrete mitzvah unto itself. That leads many others to assert that the Rambam felt the same way about the mitzvah settling in the land of Israel. It enables one to do so many other mitzvahs that he does list. He therefore deliberately and logically chose not to list it as a unique mitzvah unto itself. You see clearly that that the Jewish world is pretty much evenly divided in their views of this machlokus, this dispute, as about half of the Jews in the world live in Israel and the other half live somewhere else. Rav Rosenzweig quotes a Sifri from one of the earliest collections of the Midrash on Parshas Eikev to say that while we are exiled from the land, we should continue to keep the mitzvahs abroad so that when we return to our home in Israel, they'll be familiar to us. It's interesting to think about this perspective. It implies that the true meaning and fulfillment of being a Jew is to live in the Jewish land, while living outside of Israel, even for thousands of years, is a temporary state of being in which we practice. Maybe that's why they say he's a practicing Jew. We're practicing living the life we'll adopt once we return home. Some wonder if this is hyperbole. Others, like the Netziv, wonder if it's only talking about the Israel-specific mitzvahs. And to address this, he cites again a Gemara in Sanhedrin on the topic of arevus, the idea we know very well that all Jews are connected, responsible, guarantors one for another. That Gemara teaches that mutual responsibility only applied once we all entered into the land of Israel. In other words, outside the land, we were not truly a people in this sense. I suppose the question is left open if in times of exile it still does. In summary of this worthwhile essay by one of the modern Orthodox world's most respected and admired teachers, who, it should be noted, has lived most or all of his life in America, like his teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, it's clear that whether one lives in Israel or not, the centrality of the land to Jewish law, life, and our worldview is beyond question. Israel is our rallying point, he writes, and the direction point. Obviously, we turn our prayers every day so they'll ascend to God most easily. It's also the place where all the Torah that we read and study applies, though certainly some of that status rests upon the residence of the majority of the people there and establishment of the Third Temple. Rav Rosenzweig advocates shifting our focus of this day in particular, Yom Ha'atzmaut, from ritual commemorations of Israel to, as he says, to study and appreciation of the rich character and significance of Eretz Yisrael, reflected in Talmud, in Tanakh, Halacha, and history, end of quote, which in addition to its obvious purpose and benefit should also increase unity among the entire Jewish people and shared appreciation of our homeland. Ken yehi ratzon, so may it be God's will. May our studies and our learning lead us to greater appreciation of the land, for the promise God made our ancestors that continues to be fulfilled, for the essential importance of holding each other close wherever other Jews may live, whatever their points of view may be. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.